Now thrive the Armourers. Hello, I'm Guy Wilson, and Liveryman K. Smith and I are your guides through the 700 years of the Armourers and Brasiers Company.
The 19th century saw enormous changes in the country, in London, and in the livery companies. Cathy Ross, former curator of social history at the Museum of London, sets the scene for us by explaining how London developed.
The 19th century was a period of enormous change for the city. The population at the beginning of the century was around about 130,000. And by the end of the century, this had really declined to 50,000. And this is for people who were actually living in London. Now, there are several factors at play here, one of which is the arrival of offices. And as the financial industry really expands with the expansion of trade and empire, so the residents get displaced by new office buildings, people wanting offices for all sorts of new trade like stockbrokers and contractors and shipping merchants. And as a result of this, rates rise, land prices rise, and the whole sort of ecosystem of the city changes. Now, there are other factors at play here, including the arrival of railways and new railway stations starting from the 1850s and going up to the 1880s mean a lot of buildings are demolished. And also there are new streets constructed through the city, which again destroys a lot of houses. So London at the end of the 19th century looks and feels very different to what it was at the beginning.
The early decades of the 19th century were a quiet time for the company as it got on with its usual business. However, there was an undercurrent of dissatisfaction which pervaded the thoughts and minds of the court. After some 400 years, the hall was less and less fit for purpose. Roger Bowdler, architectural historian and upper warden, explains.
The Armourers and Brasiers were not one of the grand city companies, and their premises, I think, reflected that. They had acquired the site in 1428, they'd acquired more buildings on London Wall in the later 18th century. They'd actually refaced the exterior of their hall under their surveyor, Mr. Criswell, in the late Georgian period. But although he put a smart neoclassical skin on the outside of the building, inside it was still the ramshackle, accretive complex that the Armourers had acquired. So when you compared it to the smarter livery halls of London, it really did look a bit ramshackle.
The 19th century was also a time of great and far-reaching political changes. Here's Cathy Ross again.
The other thing that happens in the 19th century is the real political change, a change of the political environment. The Reform Act of 1832 extends the vote to middle-class people, and then there's an enormous agitation, an enormous focus on the city corporation for being a rather old-fashioned system of government, which indeed it is. It's basically unchanged since the medieval period. Now, the livery companies are embedded in the system of government that produced the corporation, and they too came under attack, partly because they were quite wealthy or perceived as quite wealthy. And people thought that, in the new 19th century, with all these new social problems arising, like poor housing for the workers and health and sanitation, that actually some of the livery company could be better used for good social ends.
So increasingly people were looking enviously at the perceived unused wealth of the livery companies as a source of money to help pay for much-needed social improvements, especially in education. Libby Glover, the company's historian, explains how this affected the livery companies.
And there was a tremendous outcry throughout England of trying to either make the church pay for it, like Trollope's the warden, or the city livery companies, who, to the popular eye, appeared to have made a lot of money out of the rising prices of property in London. This scared some liverymen There was a renter warden who wanted to abolish all dinners, all social occasions, and give all the money to widows.
So eventually, the government set up a commission to look at the provision of education and the role of institutions such as the livery companies in funding the desired improvements. And after the outcry concerning their supposed wealth and aloofness from society in general, the livery companies began to take a positive stand on social issues and education. Here's Cathy Ross again.
The livery companies responded to this, and many of them started looking to educational good works as a way of using their wealth. And many started technical education, which was a big cause of the late 19th century, things like the Sitting Gills Institute system, and setting up new institutes like the Cordwainers set up the Cordwainers School, Goldsmiths set up the Goldsmiths College. So the whole focus of the livery companies changes from being something that just supports people within the company to things with a slightly more wider outlook, educating the workforce in London generally for the future.
When the government produced its report, it was astounded at how much the city companies were already doing and exonerated them entirely, which meant that people had to pay on the rates for the educational system.
At the same time, as the country's economy expanded rapidly, the city continued to change. Seeking greater space, people, trades and businesses moved out to more suitable areas around the capital. Cathy Ross explains.
Residents moved out of the city to more salubrious places elsewhere, but so also did trades. And although there is still very, very small-scale manufacturing going on in the city, most of the successful firms have moved out to bigger premises elsewhere in London. And with the arrival of the railways, people don't need to be so near to the river. They can be near the railway stations at King's Cross or even further afield. So it really does have a big effect on the way industry is located in London.
In this whirlwind of change, the company finally took the decision to rebuild the hall. Roger Bowdler takes up the story.
So the decision was taken at the end of the 1830s for a complete, comprehensive rebuilding. And the company was lucky enough to have as its surveyor an extremely able architect called Joseph Henry Good, who had been a pupil of Sir John Soanes and was highly regarded in his profession, the profession of architecture at that time, just beginning to emerge as a distinct professional calling.
It was on the 24th of October 1839 that the foundation stone of the new hall was laid. A grand occasion attended by many of the company's members, including a large contingent from the Pontifex family, as Anthony Pontifex has written in the recent history of the company's treasures.
There were 12 Pontifexes present at the laying of the foundation stone of the current hall in 1837, one of whom had taken out a large mortgage on his own house to lend the company money towards the building of the hall.
But the new hall was expensive, and the company needed more than loans from members to pay for it. The company economised as much as it felt able, cutting down on guests, buying cheaper wines, and entertaining less, for example. But the majority was acquired by mortgaging the property at Trigg Wharf for the sum of £7,000 for 14 years at 4% per annum. What was perhaps surprising is that the company did not sell any of its valuable ancient plate. Lucy Morton of the Goldsmiths Company was surprised at this.
They are exceptional because mostly civic bodies fall on hard times, they need a new roof, building gets burnt. The first thing they do is melt the silver down. And I think that it's amazing that this group of objects survived the Civil War, but then they didn't dispose of them later on when they say they rebuilt the hall. They could have very easily sort of said, well, this is all old-fashioned stuff, we don't really need it. To celebrate the new hall, why don't we get a lot of new plate? But they didn't. These objects were, as our curator said, they're part of the DNA of the company. And by that stage, they were already clearly esteemed, valued, treasured items that were integral to the company. And when you see a group like this, which I've never seen, that feeling, that sort of intense connection between the livery and the objects comes across, that these things were so important to them and absolutely sort of integral to them as a company.
For the duration of the building work, the court moved down Coleman Street to number 25. Roger Bowdler describes the new hall.
The building that Joseph Henry Good designed for the company is a very evocative early Victorian building. It's very clearly neoclassical, and it's interesting to speculate that if it had been built just 10 years later, whether it would have been in a different style. When we look at the outside, we see this very impressive Doric frontispiece surrounding the entrance hall, with a frieze with Roman or ancient Greek armour within the frieze. If you look at the top, however, you can see the figures of artificial stone flanking the coat of arms of the company, and there we see the medieval figures in steel and brazen armour.
After the completion of the new hall, the company resumed their normal activities, including their usual convivial dinners. An amusing incident occurred when a past master of the company had a brush with the law, as related in the Chelmsford Chronicle and the Essex Standard in May 1854.
Chelmsford Court. William Gascoigne Clinker of Plaistow attended to answer to an information laid against him by John Ireland, a conductor of one of the Stratford omnibuses, for making use of abusive and insulting language towards him while in complainant's omnibus on account of a demand of 1 penny for luggage. John stated that on the last journey down from town on the night of the day in question, the defendant gentleman residing Plaistow took a place in his omnibus at the Bull Inn, Aldgate. He had a fowl with him in a basket, which he put on the top of the omnibus. On arriving Stratford, John asked for his fares and demanded of the defendant 1 penny for luggage, the basket. Clinker said, "I shall not pay you for the basket, you blackguard. The whole of you conductors are blackguards." A witness told him not to blackguard him, and he then again made use of insulting language towards him. Elizabeth Marshall stated that she was a passenger by the omnibus in question, heard the defendant's use of improper language towards the complainant, who did not misconduct himself towards the defendant. The defendant admitted the charge and was fined 20 shillings and costs.
After some 30 years, the court decided that the livery hall needed some alterations. Roger Bowdler explains.
The area where the building has been altered is in the livery hall. And as soon as you go in there, you can tell you're not any longer in a neoclassical interior. The reason for this is that in the early 1870s, the company surveyor, an architect called Alexander Graham, was requested to remodel the livery hall and bring it more in line with high Victorian taste. So what we've got is a very impressive room that retains the form of Good's original livery hall, but above we've got this splendid timber lantern that's a bit like a 16th century college grade hall. With its timber ceiling, it has decorative panels in each corner with shields, the royal shield, the shield of the City of London, etc. And there's stained glass up there. They also took out at that time a gallery that was at the West End. They took out Sonian chimney pieces. They really removed it of that neoclassical flavour that characterised the hall of just 30 years before. So we've got in the livery hall, we've got a fusion of tastes. We've got the few remains of Good's original area. You can see that in the lower level of panelling, but the rest of it is Alexander Graham and is very high Victorian in its historicist and rather romantic appearance.
After armour ceased to be generally worn and the company moved away from its manufacture, armour suffered over a century of neglect. But then, having been largely disregarded, it became a subject of interest to collectors, dealers and historians. Tom Richardson, formerly curator of armour at the Royal Armourers, explains.
Not only do we start getting collectors who are scouring Europe for medieval armour, amongst them, of course, Napoleon, who scoured most of the castles of Europe for armour to bring back to Paris. But private collectors started to collect medieval armours. And of course, what they were trying to collect was what was in least supply, the medieval armour of the knight. And so unscrupulous dealers started to produce armour, in double inverted commas, which purported to come from archaeological finds and which was being produced in London to dupe the wealthy. So many of those early collections include very large numbers of fakes, or half fakes, where an original armour can be turned with the addition of a number of other pieces into several armours to maximise profit. During that period, the first books, scholarly studies of historical armour, start to be produced. And the company begins to have an interest in having some armour on which it was based, again, which it seems to have had very little, if any, in the hall. And it's really towards the end of the 19th century that it really starts to acquire any quantity of armour.
But how did the company actually acquire what it has today?
Much of the armour in the collection was donated by former masters. An example is Alexander Graham, the architect, the artist, author of Roman Africa, and master of the company in 1862.
It was another member of the Graham family, perhaps Alexander's son, who in 1912 bequeathed a substantial collection of arms and armour to the company. As Tom explains, this included
a little German half-armour, which has been relatively overlooked on the stairs of the company hall for many years, but which turns out to have a Greenwich Burgonet helmet of the late 16th century, a really quite important piece included in it.
Throughout this century of change, the membership of the company was changing too. We can see this in the professions of the masters. In the first 4 decades of the century, 15 were metalworkers. In the last 4 decades, only 3 worked with metal. They had been replaced by businessmen, lawyers, and financiers.
The company entered the 20th century in a buoyant mood. Dangers had been avoided, and England as a whole was reasonably settled, prosperous and peaceful. Everything, of course, was to change in 1914, though the company, with its usual combination of foresight, intelligence and luck, was able to steer a path through, even narrowly avoiding a catastrophe when London was blitzed in the Second World War.
Next time, a century of wars and great social change that forged our modern world. But through it all, the company prospered and grew. This has been a Past Master production for Basilisco Press. Our thanks to Roger Bowdler, Libby Glover, Lucy Morton, Tom Richardson and Cathy Ross.